It, in terms of designating who is a terrorist and who isn't, that is not my job as Minister of Finance or Deputy Prime Minister.
Okay.
We have authorities whose job is to do that.
Right. And so it's not your authority to designate Tamara Leach, Chris Barber, Tom Marazzo, or Danny Boldford terrorists. That's somebody else has to do that.
Yes, we have intelligence services, we have enforcement agencies whose job is to determine who is a terrorist. And
Okay,
that's
so
entirely appropriate. It's,
Can I bring up?
can I say one thing about
Yeah,
that?
just a second. If I can bring up document ssm.cam.00008764_rel.001, please. And you can, while he's pulling that up, if you want to add to your answer. Okay, if we can scroll down to page, I believe this is a note with Dave. What page? 12, page 12, please. And this is a note that I understand you wrote with Dave from CSIS. That's 11. And this is a meeting with Dave from CSIS. And if you scroll down, keep going. Okay. And there you say that you need to designate the group as terrorists. So but it's not your job, but you wanted to designate them as terrorists, right?
So that handwritten note in my notebook, I can assure you that was not a meeting with the director of CSIS, with whom I didn't have a meeting.
It says it's okay. It's with David Vignon from CSIS.
It doesn't say that. It says it's with a gentleman called Dave.
Which Dave?
That meeting, that is not an account of
Which
a
Dave?
meeting with Dave Vigneault because I didn't have a meeting
which Dave is in
with
those
the
notes,
CSIS
ma'am?
director.
Which Dave is in those notes? What's Dave's last name?
I need to see my whole notebook that you're referring to, but I can tell you
It
for
only says
certain.
Dave.
I can tell you for certain that I did not have a meeting during this time with the CSIS director.
Okay, so
I can exclude that 100%.
I'm just going to, this isn't a document, I don't need to bring it up, but you stayed in the House, Mr. Speaker. The members opposite has just used the bad apple excuse. She has excused the desecration of the national. Yes?
Something that the Deputy Prime Minister said in the House.
Yeah.
There's an objection there for parliamentary privilege.
This is a parliamentary commission. There is no parliamentary privilege.
It does exist. Parliamentary privilege
absolutely,
does exist.
It does exist, but because this is a report to Parliament pursuant to the case I gave you earlier in McIver, it doesn't apply. You can actually ask all of it because we're carrying out a parliamentary function and there's no liability here. It's just a report to Parliament, and the Federal Court of Appeal has agreed.
I'm not aware of that.
I gave you the McIver case quite a while ago when we talked about the objections, and I think, yeah, it's there.
Well, I'd ask my friend the document that he's referring to so that we know what he's talking about, so we can understand the parliamentary.
This is just a statement from the Deputy Prime Minister in the House. And Mr. Speaker, the members opposite, this is what it says, use just the bad apples excuse. She has excused the declaration.
I think we're going to have to sort this out because I don't think at this stage, and I apologize, I'm not as familiar with you as you are about that case, and clearly the Crown is not either, the government. So I think we're going to have to find that. So I'd like you to hold that.
Okay, I'll come back to
question.
it. But you do recall, ma'am, that you had expressed concerns publicly with respect to desecration to national monuments. Is that fair?
I'm going to need advice from my counsel on whether things I said in Parliament I should be speaking about.
Okay,
I'm
so
not
here, I'll
an
I'll move
expert
on.
here,
It's
so.
okay. So one of the things that happened during the protest in Ottawa dealt with the national monument, the Terry Fox statue. Do you remember reading about that?
I do. Yes, I do remember the Terry Fox statue. I remember discussing it with my children.
Yeah,
They were
and-
very upset.
Yeah, and there was, and that Terry Fox statute, they put a hat on Terry Fox's head and then put a flag in his arm. And then there was a mandate freedom sign on it.
I don't remember specifically how the Terry Fox statue was
Yeah.
implicated in this, but I do remember reading about it, and I remember it specifically because my children were aware of it and were upset.
Right. And so I went online and I just looked at how many times someone's done that to that statute, and it seems to be hundreds. So I'm just going to put this one to you. If someone puts an LGBTQ flag on the Terry Fox statute and flowers in the statute, is that a desecration?
I am not going to go into, I really don't think it's my job or helpful for Canadians for me to go into a discussion of what is okay and not okay.
But
to
you've
do
said
with
it
the
was a
Terry Fox
desecration.
statute.
When you've called it a desecration in public, that was what you're referring to, based on what was put on the statute. So is it fair to say that it's only a desecration to you if you don't agree with the message?
Again, you've made a couple of leaps beyond anything that I've said.
That's okay, it's the public record. With respects to, you had said you had concerns for violent actions and interactions with respect to protesters, and I take it that was nationally? You had concerns nationally? Or was it just Ottawa?
I described in my testimony a moment ago 2 specific areas where I had concern. I was worried about the potential for conflict between angry people in Ottawa and the occupation. Can I finish the answer? Because I have something to add. And as I said in my earlier testimony, and I believe the mayor of Windsor shared this concern, I was concerned about the possibility of that kind of a conflict in Windsor. And I was concerned about the situation in Coutts,
Okay.
which we heard about at the IRG
Right.
on this Saturday.
Okay, so, but protesters, I don't know if you heard the testimony of the mayor there, but he said that 75% of his small town supported the blockades and that many of the properties have F. Trudeau flags all over them. So you wouldn't have concern with that specific protest, would you?
My reference to Coutts just now was very specific. At the IRG on Saturday, the 12th of February, the RCMP commissioner raised with us the possibility that there were weapons there. And
Right.
that was a source of great concern.
Right, and so you can agree that police investigate weapons offenses all over the country every day.
Again, I'm not a police expert, but that seems like a reasonable common sense observation.
So simply because the police know a weapon is somewhere, you can agree with me it's not a national emergency.
The concern about a single weapon somewhere in Canada, and as you say, I think that one weapon being investigated somewhere in Canada, if that were to happen today, certainly.
Right, and you had testified earlier about what you viewed as, ensuring that we as Canadians have a good international reputation so that people come to our country and want to do business with us. Is that fair?
Yes, that's something I was very concerned about.
Okay, and I take it when you consider those sort of things, you look at various reports, and I'm sure you look at various indexes, and I'm sure you look at the Transparency International Index. Is that fair?
I am familiar with the Transparency International Index, but I haven't looked at it recently.
Okay, well, since 2019, we've began to fall. All right? And we have now come down out of the top 10, and it continues to decline. So can you agree with me that Canada not being transparent hurts our relationship internationally?
I have to say that I disagree with the premise of the question. I think Canada is a very transparent democracy. And in fact, the commission that we're part of right now is a part of Canadian transparency.
Right.
That's why it's important.
And on that point, if I told you that there is a whole bunch of unlawfully redacted documents that we've been fighting over and we're waiting for an order just to get them today, and we haven't had them for this whole proceeding, do you think that's transparent?
Again, and with apologies, I can't agree with the premise of the question. I think that, but what I can say is, I think that the fact that this commission exists, that these hearings are being held, that they're public, is really important for Canada and is a measure of Canadian transparency.
Right. And one of your concerns, of course, with transparency and our reputation, was that you would want your government to be as transparent as possible, right?
Again, here, I do believe that transparency and accountability are important, but I also recognize that cabinet confidentiality in many issues needs to be preserved for a reason. And, you know, there are areas where transparency is not appropriate, and I recognize that as well.
Okay. Can you agree with me if, you know, anytime it comes out that the Canadian government has misled Canadians on something, it really hurts our international reputation, doesn't it?
I think that the Canadian government should always seek not to mislead Canadians.
Right.
First and foremost, because that's wrong, and that is not the way we should treat Canadians.
And in the many statements that have been said by all the politicians in this matter, one of the main things they talked about, and Justin Trudeau did particularly on the following the first weekend of the invocation of the Emergencies Act, was these horrible, the Nazi flag and all those things that people saw in Ottawa. You heard him say that?
Again, I have to say, prior to coming here, I have not specifically reviewed specific statements of the Prime Minister. If you want to point to a specific one, maybe we could discuss it.
You'd agree if it turned out those flags were linked to your government. That would look really bad for our international reputation, wouldn't it?
Based on some
Okay, next, if I could call on the CCLA, please.
Good afternoon, Minister Freeland. My name is Eva Krajewska, and I'm counsel for the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. Minister Freeland, I'd like to start off with going back to your testimony in chief with respect to the Ambassador Bridge. If I understand your testimony correctly, you stated that the blockage of the Ambassador Bridge escalated matters in your mind significantly. That's fair?
So first of all, good afternoon, Ms. Krajewska. Nice, well, maybe I shouldn't say nice.
Maybe you can tell me that later.
Yeah, but good afternoon, and I will try to answer your questions. And I think when you say testimony, you're referring to the
Your
2
exchange
hours
with Ms.
this morning.
Chowdhury.
So try to be precise, yes, as finance minister, in my judgment around the economic impact of the illegal blockades and occupation, certainly the blockade of the Ambassador Bridge was a very significant escalation.
Right, and precisely the words you just used now, it was at least at that point, if not earlier, that to your mind, the blockades and the demonstrations became illegal.
No, I don't think I want to be so precise about that. What I am very clear about is the blockade of the bridge made this a real economic crisis for Canada. And that was a moment when, as finance minister, I really had to figure out a way to stop the harm to Canada from getting worse and from really snowballing and irreparably damaging our country.
And you said because it had potentially exponential harm to the Canadian economy.
Yes, I mean, I wasn't taking notes of what I said, but I believe that.
Yes. And that's when you started looking at the Bank Act and the PCLMFTA as potential, using the measures under that legislation to stop those demonstrations.
Again, here, let me be sort of very precise about my state of mind. From my perspective, we had a number of different, but certainly inspired by one another, occupations and blockades across the country. There was the occupation of Ottawa, and I can't tell you the chronology of them. I'm sure you're familiar with them. But so there's the occupation of Ottawa, there was Coutts, there was Emerson. In terms of economic impact, the Ambassador Bridge was the most significant. There was also, I believe, Sarnia, Niagara, and Surrey. So from my perspective, what was happening was this kind of metastasizing whack-a-mole copycat events around the country. And some of them had a greater specific economic impact than others. The Ambassador Bridge sort of stepped up the impact, but it was not the case, in my view, that this was just the Ambassador Bridge.
And I didn't, that was not the purpose of my question, that
Okay.
it was only about the Ambassador Bridge. I understand your evidence that the blockades generally had a significant economic impact on Canada that you were concerned about. That's fair.
Again, can I say yes and offer an explanation?
I'm not trying to make this controversial or to trap you.
Oh, no,
I'm just trying to establish this to move on to my next point.
Okay, well, I would just say you are a lawyer, so a person does have to be careful.
Yeah.
And I say that with the greatest respect for all the lawyers who are here. But look, the point that I just want to be clear about, and I do think that there has been in some of the public thinking about this a lack of clarity, is from my perspective, one way that you could look at the economic harm was what happens every day arithmetically and just add it up. From my perspective, that grossly understates the potential economic harm that was being done. Because what I was really worried about was that as this goes on, every single hour, more damage is done to American confidence in us as a trading partner, and more damage is done to us as an investment destination. Witness the Banana Republic comment.
Right, and exactly. So you were concerned that this economic disruption was painting Canada as politically unstable, not a place that is safe to invest for, and potentially a banana republic, which by definition is an unstable country. That's
I mean,
fair.
Banana Republic wasn't my term, but it
No,
was a
it's
term
not.
that had an impact on me for sure.
Okay. And now, Minister Freeland, you can appreciate that from the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, our concern is that the Emergencies Act should not be used to quash political dissent. You understand that.
I totally do. And if I can be personal for one moment, in my life as a person and a writer and an elected politician, I would always prefer for myself to be on the same side as the Civil Liberties Association. That these are values I hold very dear. And so I understand the urgency with which you champion them.
Right. So I think you would also agree that the Emergencies Act should not be used because demonstrators are disagreeing with government policy. I think that's a very low threshold here that I'm putting to you.
Yes, I absolutely agree with that.
And I think you also know in your life, both as a journalist and as a minister, that on occasion, the right to freedom of assembly and freedom of expression includes actions that are of civil disobedience.
I do recognize that that sometimes happens. And I also recognize that laws are enforced against people committing acts of civil disobedience. People can believe in something and can bravely commit those acts and pay the price of the legal penalty.
And exactly. And civil disobedience will on occasion also involve serious economic disruption. And I'll give you a few examples. A general strike is a form of civil disobedience that causes economic disruption. You'd agree with that?
If the tendency of these questions is to equate the economic harm that was being done to Canada and that would have risen had these illegal occupations and blockades continued with the harm done by a general strike, then I strongly disagree.
Okay. And sometimes blockades by Indigenous people cause economic harm, correct?
They do.
And sometimes occupations like Occupy Wall Street or Occupy Toronto may cause economic harm.
Certainly, but the economic harm, to take those two specific instances, very, very limited actually compared to the damage being done to Canada. And if I may, had what was happening in Canada been about, I don't know, the field behind the National Art Gallery being occupied for a long time, and maybe some comparable public park in Windsor being occupied, and so on across the country. That would have been entirely legitimate protest, but that wasn't what was happening.
Okay, maybe I can take you to an example closer to home. For me, when Solidarity had a general strike in Poland and blocked the ports, Western democracies applauded that action. That was economic disruption was viewed as a legitimate form of political protest at that time.
I'm going to allow myself one personal comment, which is I did make a bet with myself that you and I would end up talking about Solidarność.
Yeah, coming from the Eastern Bloc, it was going to happen.
Yeah, I am aware of that. And I don't think you'll be surprised to think that I thought about that at the time. And more recently and more specifically, I thought about the Maidan in Ukraine. And when we took this action. And let me talk about a few differences. And the main one is this. Solidarność, as you know very well, was a protest against a government that was illegitimate. That was from whence it drew its power and legitimacy. This was people rising up against an authoritarian, and I would even say in the case of Poland, colonial regime.
Okay.
In Canada, what happened was a democratically elected government that was actually acting on policies that we had campaigned on just that summer. So it was a fresh democratic mandate. There was no lack of transparency with the people of Canada. And people who disagreed with those policies were holding the country's economy hostage.
Okay, Ms.
And
Freeland,
that was not appropriate.
I do want to raise a concern. I'm assuming you're not saying that democracy only operates at the time of casting our ballot. Obviously, I think you acknowledge that we are able to protest in between those times. So even after you were democratically elected, people could protest your government's policies, correct?
100%. And I am in no way suggesting that the act of protest is anti-democratic. On the contrary, the right to protest, I think it's a feature, not a bug of democracy. But what I was saying, which I believe very strongly, is there is a big difference between acts of popular resistance and even revolution against an authoritarian regime and protest in a democracy.
And Minister Freeland, I'd like to just take you to, you started your comments this morning as well with the bigger geopolitical issues here between President Putin trying to demonstrate that his way of dictatorships is preferable to Western democracies. And one, I think you can appreciate that there have been countries in the world that have said, you should invest in us because we are politically stable. We do not have general strikes. We do not tolerate dissent. And I want to end on this. Surely you agree that in Canada, which is a democracy, the right to protest, the right to demonstration must be sedulously protected, and that economic security does not trump those rights.
So many things packed in there.
I know, I'm running out of time, so it's all going in.
So many things packed in there, and many of them I agree with. I have reported on a lot of authoritarian regimes that spoke about their stability as something that should be attractive to investors. And clearly, I strongly disagree with that argument. My concern when it came to the economic security of Canada was about our ability not to not have political debate. Political debate is a sign of a healthy society. The fact we're having this commission, that's a healthy democracy. The fact that in question period we yell at each other, I really don't like it, but it's a sign of a healthy democracy. What was undermining of Canada's economic security sufficiently dangerously that I believe we needed to act, and it was the right thing to do, was that our trade was being stopped and was being seriously blocked. And I was very worried that that was handing arguments to US protectionists who were already on the move, and that had that relationship been seriously damaged, that would really hurt Canada.
And Minister Freeland, my last point, you mentioned at some point that it would have been one thing for the protesters to stand with a placard at the War Museum and protest. You mentioned that today in testimony with me.
I didn't say War Museum and I didn't say placard.
Sorry.
But the basic idea, I think we're in the same
I'm sorry,
zone.
I'm thinking of a different Ottawa monument. But you agree that public assembly and the right to protest goes beyond simply me standing on a green lawn in front of a government building, that it does encompass more than that, and that Canada should protect that to be a vibrant democracy.
I, am not going to right now try to define with you specifically, what is give examples of protests. But what I will say, and I really agree with, and I think one of the lines that very much in my mind in this decision is I do agree with you that in a democracy, the right to protest is important and has to be protected. And yeah, that's such an obvious statement, and I agree with that. And I agree, so since it's obvious, I'll say it and I won't gild the lily.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Commissioner Rouleau.
Okay, we have 5 minutes left. I don't know if the Canadian Constitution Foundation wants to start or...
Lunch, but I'm in your hands.
I don't know. I think we'll adjourn for lunch. How's that?
Okay, great. Thank you.
And we'll come back then at 2 o'clock.
The commission is in recess until 2 o'clock. La commission est levée jusqu'à 14 heures.